So you have practice test 6 for this week is what we're focusing on. Let me just double check that, but that should be right. So also assigned for this week were readings, okay? So what you need to make sure that you do, if you haven't done so already, is make sure that you've been keeping up with the reading, because it's going to provide additional information about the different sections of the test, which is going to help you. The more insights you have about this test, the easier it's going to be. Okay. So I want everyone, if you haven't done the reading or haven't kept up with it, please do the reading, because I provide all the resources for you. It's all in the document from our second class in terms of notes. So I do want you to access that. It's also available online on the College Board's website. So do make sure that you have kind of gotten everything done that you need to. Okay, so we are going to really kind of look at start with looking at annotations today for practice test 6. We're going to continue our grammar discussion too. We only briefly started it last week, but we're going to for the latter half of the class switch over to math because we haven't really spent as much time there in general. So if you have any math questions from the practice test for this week, please make sure you have them ready to ask, and you can even make a note of it in the chat when we get there, and then we can or send me an email privately if you prefer. And then we can kind of go from there in terms of troubleshooting specific types of math questions later on in the class. Okay, so for today, I really want to kind of look at our grammar again and to kind of break down different types of questions that you see on practice tests. So this week you had practice test 9, I believe, for homework. Give me just 1 second before we dive into that. Yeah, so last week it was doing practice test 6. So last week's class was focused on practice test 9. This week we were focusing on practice test 6. So we are going to go through, take a quick look at the reading, which was chapters 8, 13, and 17 to 18. Again, just like I was telling you, you do want to make sure you're doing the reading because it's going to help you in the long run. Okay, and then we're going to go through some practice problems for the writing and the reading sections for practice test 6 before we kind of dive more into some math after we do some grammar review. Okay, so that's kind of our plan for today. Give me just 1 second and I can start sharing my screen. Okay, so for any of you who ever have any question about homework going forward, it's all in that document that I sent you. So if you need to work ahead because you're not going to be able to have time a week, you do want to make sure that you're doing that. Okay, so last week we were working on practice test 6 for this coming week for today. So you had chapters 8, 13, and 17, 18. And if you couldn't find those chapters to do the reading or weren't sure where to look for them, they're all here up until chapter 21. Chapter 21, the College Board doesn't have that link available online to that particular section. But it does, these sections for the math do talk about similar concepts. They did kind of change things up a little bit on their website for the digital forms of the chapters that they have of the content material, but it's all the same information. Okay, so you can review that and it'll help. Okay, so for today it was chapter 8. So reading was synthesis. So last week you were reading about rhetoric. You were also reading about what did we have specifically? We had chapters 7, 11 to 12. So 11 and 12 are from the writing section, so the writing and language test. So that would have been writing and language, expression of ideas, and writing and language standard English convention. So for this week, you just had the chapter 13 for writing and language, and you had the chapter for synthesis for the reading, which we're going to look at in a second. And then you had 2 chapters from math, which were 17 and 18. Yes. Yes. Okay. So you had 17 and 18 that are due for this week for math. So let's kind of start by just taking a quick look at the reading synthesis. But before I do that, does anyone have any lingering questions from the kind of previous reading sections that you want to ask that you didn't ask in a previous class, in terms of understanding the College Board's kind of breakdown of what they call information and ideas type questions or sections of the reading test, and the rhetoric type questions that they kind of classify and break down what they see as their question types, even though the specific questions that you see are going to be very diverse, okay, and might not, they still fit into these very broad categories of the College Board's kind of classification here. Okay, so no question. Anyone have any questions about information and ideas section for the reading or the rhetoric before we begin with synthesis? If so, please let me know in the chat right now. So I'll give you a minute or so to kind of look through your notes or kind of look through the chapter before we kind of go on to synthesis. Okay, so no questions on that, on the information and ideas section of the reading or the rhetoric before we begin? No? All right, great. If you do have a question and you don't get a chance to ask it, or you don't necessarily want to ask in class, you can always email me. You have my contact information. So please make use of that and let me know if you have any questions, okay? Because if students don't ask questions in class, I'm going to think that you are understanding everything, you know exactly what you need to do, you're not having any issues with your kind of strategies or anything like that. So I'm going to think that you're good to go, okay? But if you are having issues or you're not sure how to address something, or a strategy isn't exactly working for you, or you're not sure about content information, or how to register or anything for your test, feel free to send me an email or contact me. Or in terms of registration, you should all be checking in with your school because your school and the program that's running this class should know more about your particular testing circumstances. Okay. All right, so without further ado, we're going to look at the synthesis. I always have too many windows on my screen. So let me share that. Actually, I was sharing that. I'm sorry. I've had a crazy week. So, so things are a little bit up in the air a little bit. So, but chapter 8. So reading synthesis. I know we kind of went through some of the reading chapters before. I'm not going to actually read through this verbatim because all of you should have done that already for today's class. But I do want to kind of point out some kind of key elements that you want to understand from this chapter. So really, like this is what the College Board calls, like they think that they have 3 different types of questions, but they really have many different types of questions that they're asking within certain content type of, or task oriented type of content. Okay, so like depending on what it is that they're doing and what their kind of learning objectives are, the type of question, the category of question is going to change. So you have things like the information and ideas type questions that are focused on understanding data, understanding information from a text, breaking down a text, kind of figuring out what the kind of core concepts of a, sorry if you can hear my cat. She always seems to make an appearance during our class, but that happens. Okay, so kind of just getting back on track here with the reading test, they kind of break down the information and ideas section as sections that are like, or types of questions that are really that fall into that category, but they may be very you might have a broad range of question types that you actually have on the exam, that they don't really go through the step-by-step process of breaking them down like I do in terms of coding and categorization of question types. But it is important for you to kind of take away that those specific, that they have specific questions that are informational and data focused. Again, I apologize if anyone can hear my cat. She's like meowing up a storm right now. So I apologize. So the second chapter for reading in terms of questions was dealing with rhetoric. So that has to do with language and your use of language, or an author's use and command of language, and their ability to use rhetorical strategies and techniques and kind of figurative language and things like that are kind of falling into that realm of expertise in terms of being a good writer, being a good speaker, being being able to understand, a good communicator, basically. So you're dealing with communication, you're dealing with understanding kind of rhetorical analysis and things like that. If that's a new term for you, that's okay. You don't really need to know it for this test, but that's kind of what you do when you're analyzing a text on that's dealing with a rhetoric type question. You're assessing the rhetoric use of the author. Okay, so that's really all you need to take away from that. But the synthesis section is a bit more complicated, because synthesizing is a process where you are performing a different level of knowledge. You're expressing a different level of knowledge. And for those of you who are not familiar with what I mean by different levels of knowledge, I mean whether or not, like, how deeply you understand something, okay, and what you're able to do with that information, and to demonstrate your understanding or take it beyond what you know, and turn it into something new. Okay, so what synthesis type questions do is that they, like, as they say here, they're focusing mainly on putting information and ideas together into a bigger whole to acquire a deeper, broader understanding of a topic. Okay, so basically what I was saying is that synthesizing involves a higher level of thinking and knowledge, and it is asking you to think more critically about a given topic. Okay, so you're still focusing on ideas and information, and you're still kind of working with language and understanding how rhetoric, like what the author's rhetorical strategies and things are that they're using, but you're taking it beyond just identifying what that is, or beyond just simply like defining what that means, or what the author is trying to talk to you about. And you're taking it a step beyond kind of just basic analysis too, which is to kind of analyze and interpret something, and then take it beyond that kind of thinking. So you then are not only applying those skills, but you are looking at them in a different light, so to speak. Okay. So all that really kind of means is that you're thinking very deeply about the topic. So these are the deeper questions, the more global type questions. So this has to do with like purpose questions, or dealing with our understanding of like why we're using a particular technique. So it's the why and the how, which is what analysis is, but it's also looking at why, like what the overall significance is. So you're looking for a deeper meaning in the text. Okay, so you're answering big questions, basically. You're dealing with things like central themes and concepts, or thesis statements, or argumentative claims. All of those types of things are central ideas that are kind of driving the whole work. You're also, so they kind of break it down as to two different question types, because they focus their synthesis type questions really on select passages. So you're not going to have these types of harder questions on every single passage. Okay, so this is really focused more on understanding like things from the paired passage, or one passage, like some passages that may have more, like one or more informational graphics. So infographics. So they have, I mean, you will see some on the test regardless, but whether or not they appear in a paired passage, or whether or not they appear with a passage that is focused on like an informational, like you have charts or graphs or a picture or something that is integrated into the text, that's part of the text. That's generally where you will see these kind of deeper level thinking questions. Okay, so they kind of break it down into two different categories, two main types. So questions that are focused more on analyzing multiple texts. So that would be something like the paired passage, where you're making connections between topically related history or social studies or science passages. Okay. And I think that's pretty expected, because you're going beyond just interpreting each passage. You're going beyond what you need to do to understand each individual passage, and thinking and making connections between the two different passages regarding a related topic, or connections, like especially the analogy type questions. Those are going to fall under this kind of umbrella of synthesis type questions. Okay. Other types of questions that fall into this category are questions that ask you to analyze quantitative information. So these are your data type questions, your data response type questions that we've kind of gone over, or even sometimes your evidence support, like type questions. So those ES type questions that are asking you to find information. I kind of will consider that a type of synthesis that you're doing, because you do have to actually find the material to prove and understand and interpret what that text means, and then think about it and apply it and figure out, how does this actually support what the question is asking me, the evidence that I need it to find, like why is this the evidence over something else. So that's another level of synthesis, but it's not actually in the College Board's kind of classification of it. So you are doing these skills on on other questions. So on more of the rhetoric type questions or the information and ideas type questions, but on a different scale. Okay, so for the actual synthesis type questions that they're kind of classifying as a separate question type is really looking at data, looking at graphics like tables, charts, graphs, making conclusions like drawing, deducing information, examining it, breaking it down, analyzing it, assessing it, all those kinds of applicable terms to help you understand what the data is, why it's there, how the author's using it in particular, because this test doesn't just ask you to analyze data, like to interpret just the data at face value. You are also considering the data within the context of the entire text, the entire passage. So that is requiring you to do a level of synthesis in here. It's a very basic level still, but it's in that kind of category. Okay. Another kind of thing just to note is that it's going to be asking you to, synthesis type questions ask you to kind of integrate information that's visually displayed, so or graphically displayed with information ideas in the passage. Okay. They do kind of go through more in depth what they feel each of those main types of questions for synthesis questions are. I'm not going to go through that because everyone should have read through that already. And they do kind of give you a little breakdown about the analyzing quantitative information. So analyzing like numbers and data that is being used to support what an author is saying. Okay. Yeah, data reasoning type questions. So that's really what this synthesis chapter was about. I do want to, I'm going to stop sharing for a second and switch to one of our sections. Does anyone have any questions on the synthesis chapter that was due for today? If so, please put your question in the chat, or you can email me, although I will not receive your email until after class. Okay, so chapter 8, and then we had, it should have been chapter 13. All right. So chapter 13, which is sample writing and language test questions. So this is the College Board's breakdown for this chapter. So this is dealing with our writing and language test, where they kind of go through the instructions that are kind of the standard introduction to all of this section, which everyone is by now very familiar with, okay, or should be. You typically only have passages that are they're shorter on this section, so like typically 400 to 450 words at most. I mean, that's more on the lengthy side, but typically we've kind of we've covered that too in terms of the differences between the passage length between the reading section and the writing and language section. So really, I mean, this section is really just kind of going through and giving you a breakdown of certain types of questions. So I mean, we can even take a look. So this is an example. This would be a data response type question because it's asking you to refer to information in the text. In the infographic. Actually, this one, I'm sorry. These questions do involve the infographic, but this particular question is focused more on the sentence pattern. that's being established in the paragraph, which is a different type of question, but it's still focused more on the paragraph level than on the like a broader textual level. Okay. Here, this is a grammar type question. It's dealing with conventions of usage. So you're focusing on which type of question is going to be, I mean, like which response makes the most grammatical sense and in terms of writing. Okay, so dealing with writing and editing type of conventions. So in this case, it's asking you to look at section question 2, which is all the way up here. So you have to go back and find it in the text. So you always want to make sure you do that, but you don't want to just look at what is in what's underlined. You do need to look at that in order to figure out what is grammatical or not, but you need to do that within the broader, at minimum, within the broader context of that sentence. Okay, so last time we were talking a little bit more about sentences, which we're going to continue with as well as looking at some other kind of grammar concepts. But this is kind of the starting point that you go for when you're dealing with a question from the writing and language section, is that you have to not only look at what's underlined and what is being focused on, but you have to at least, at the very minimum, and usually it's more that it requires you doing more reading than just reading through a sentence, because you have to figure out, are we talking about ideas here? And if we are, we definitely need to be looking a bit before and a bit below our question and our sentence, so that we can figure out what is appropriate in that given context of the essay. Okay. So in this case, this is a more of a grammatical detail type question. It's because it's dealing with punctuation, so it's more of a grammar and like a mechanics and conventions type thing, because if we're looking at this, it's giving us different options, and we have to identify in this question what type of grammar issue we're dealing with. Are we dealing with just a punctuation issue, even though if we kind of notice, it can't be punctuation, because every single version that they like, every single like possible answer choice includes a comma. It has the same exact punctuation. So it is not a comma issue that we're addressing, even if it is a mechanics and conventions type question. It is focused more on grammaticality in terms of like subject verb agreement in this case. So we have occur, it is as the first answer choice, and then occur, they are, occurs, they are, occurs, it is. So here we are definitely dealing with understanding grammatical agreement between the pronoun and the antecedent, and between subject and verb. So last week, I think we were talking more about subjects and verbs a bit. So I do kind of want to expand on this idea, but let's kind of see some other example types of questions. So here, in section 3, we're really focused more on sentence structure and dealing with maintaining parallel structure. If you're not really sure what I mean by that, we're going to go into that today. So yeah, so, and then question 4 here in their kind of example is again dealing with with more of an ideas type of question, because you have to look at organization of the information that's in of the content. You have to figure out, they're asking you to specifically look for an effective transition word or phrase that is going to specifically help you move from the information in this sentence to the or in this paragraph to the following paragraph, to making connections here. So you have to find the most effective transition between ideas and figure out which is most appropriate given this context and what you're trying to achieve. Okay. So in this case, you do need to make sure that things are grammatically correct in terms of what they give you, and what's the most effective choice, what's the best option available. Okay, and they're saying in this case, choice A is the best answer because it effectively signals the shift in the paragraph to the example of a transportation planner might perform if he or she were employed in a rural area and asked to consider the effects of a new factory built on the outskirts of a small town. Okay, so I'm not going to go into that right now in more depth because I want us to be able to get to grammar before we kind of move on. And I want us to be able to look at practice test 6. So these are just kind of some examples of breaking down the types of questions and identifying the kind of key content areas that they think and they're classifying for how what exactly you're looking to identify. So here we're dealing with conventions and punctuations, the punctuation type question. And we can kind of see that because there's different punctuation. I mean, and this one doesn't have any punctuation. This one, we changed the apostrophe to a comma after job. So we take out possession here. And then the 5th answer choice, the original answer choice, 5, has planner apostrophe S, job, comma. Okay, so where you have both, if we kind of look at this, sorry to be kind of flying through this a little bit, but everyone should have gone through it already. So where you have a combination of the apostrophe S and the comma for that first choice, just the apostrophe S in the second choice without a comma, a third choice of no apostrophe and a comma, and then D where you have no punctuation whatsoever in that particular section. So you have to look at the broader context of the sentence and what these ideas are kind of talking about in this section. Okay, so you're asked to differentiate between, so that means to essentially distinguish between possessive and plural nouns. And you must also recognize and eliminate unnecessary punctuation. Okay, so they're saying B ends up being the right answer choice because the comma was unnecessary, but you needed the apostrophe S to show possession. Okay, versus this S in C and D, which is showing pluralization, really. So it's showing that we have more than one thing for this noun, and it's making it a noun, whereas here planner's job, planner is kind of describing our job, whereas planner's job here, we're not really sure if this is being used, supposed to be, we would expect this to be planner's jobs if we were talking about job as a noun here, and different things like that. So you do want to make sure that you are paying attention to those kinds of issues, okay, which we're going to continue, and just kind of effective language use. There's nothing else really in this section except kind of breaking down sample type questions, which is very useful, I think, for you because you get a different perspective and a different kind of classification system to see which works best for you. And it's quite possible that the system that I generally recommend for students, because it works for most students, might not work for you. And that's perfectly fine, so long as you can identify how to answer the questions, what you need to do, and you can determine an approach that works best for you in the long run, okay, to be able to help you on this exam, okay? So that's really all I wanted to look at. We'll look at the math chapter a little bit later today. I do want to switch gears kind of now and go to our okay, sorry. I want to go to our answers, our notes here. That's where I want to start off with. Okay, so just kind of to recap then, we just looked at chapter 8 and chapter 13, and we're in a little bit, we'll look at 17 to 18 from today. Again, we'll also look at the practice questions from practice test 6. So if you have questions, do make sure you're getting those prepared, or you came prepared already, which everyone should have done, with a list of questions to ask. Okay. So I wanted to just take a quick look at some of the general grammar concepts. We're not really going to focus on the reading type questions because I think everyone kind of has that down already, unless you have questions, which you can ask me about. But again, just kind of reiterating here, remembering our timing for the writing test, the writing and language test is 8 minutes per passage. So we have only a short amount of time for each question for each passage to break down and identify what the question is asking. So that's why on the writing and language test, it's very important for you to identify the question type and be able to figure out how to answer it as quickly as possible. And most of the time you want to go with your gut instinct because it should sound grammatically correct to you as an English speaker. If it doesn't, or if English isn't your first language, that's fine. Then you might want to take a little bit more time on grammar type questions to make sure that they're kind of working and focus more on the ideas that are trying to be expressed and making sure that they sound that there's something that you can understand, and that they are focused on that they would make sense to someone else who speaks English, okay? So that you can communicate those ideas effectively, okay? So again, everyone will be annotating on this section, should be annotating. So that includes circling proper nouns and numbers. Again, it can include as well circling the box numbers that are in the text for each question, and coding the passage in terms of identifying question types, which you'll see on my practice test for the first two sections, for the reading test and the writing and language test. Also underlining keywords and concepts, but I think for this section it's more beneficial to identify key information in the questions than it is to find key information in the text, because it's not as much of a reading comprehension question as it is your ability to be a writer and a editor, and the audience member, to be able to kind of act as all of those at once to kind of help you understand, is this author's message being conveyed effectively? What is their message? Is it what they were trying to achieve? And figuring that out. Okay. So basic kind of questions. Again, we looked at this last week, but we have knowledge and grammar questions. Again, I apologize if you can hear my cat. She's very vocal today. Knowledge of grammar and mechanics of language, standard English conventions. You have expression of ideas, syntax type questions, organization, flow, evidence and supporting details. strength of argument, rhetorical techniques, and strategies. So this is a broad range of questions. So you have a lot of things that go into idea related questions. So they can be anything from like the technical formatting, so technical organization and structure or format of a piece based on the type of piece it is, or the kind of structure in terms of paragraphing and sentences, the types of sentences you have, if things are logically arranged, that they flow and that they're supporting the overall, the main idea, the central concept, the thesis, the argumentative claim. So you want to really kind of look at these type questions with covering a broad range. So looking not only on a detail level, on a minute level within like a tinier level on the for the passage in terms of looking at ideas and concepts expressed within a sentence or at a word level or a clause level or a phrase level, whatever it is. You want to be able to also think in the broader context of the work as a whole. Okay, so you always kind of want to keep that idea in the back of your mind, the global picture, so the big picture of what's going on in a work, while you're also looking at all the pieces of the puzzle that you're putting together. Okay, so I think that's actually a pretty. It's like, keep in mind that you have the frame of the puzzle, just to kind of go with this metaphor here, but kind of keep the idea that you have, there's a structure to it, that you need to figure out how all these pieces fit together, because you know that they all go together in certain, there might be a section here, there might be a section down here, or pieces that look very similar that belong to the same, that are part of the same section. And you might be trying to kind of put them all together. So you kind of have to keep in mind that framework of what the picture is supposed to look like for the puzzle. And as you're also looking on a detail level of looking at all those tiny little pieces that are, how do they fit together? Are they kind of working together? Why are they not working together? Or are they like, do the pieces actually match up, or are they very close and not actually fitting? So you need to apply that kind of same idea, that same kind of approach to like analyzing an essay is, and also kind of how you do, just like you would when you're writing an essay, you need to be able to kind of think about all the component parts that make up the whole, while trying to keep an idea of what my end goal is, like what is my thesis statement that's connecting everything, that's the binding thread that's making all those component parts fit together, and flow well, that they're like, that it's logical, that someone out, and it's organized, it's like you're able to kind of flow from one idea to another in a way that someone else is going to be able to easily understand, and you're effectively using all of the tools in that you have access to present what it is that you're trying to say. Okay. So you want to kind of keep that in mind. I'm sorry, there's like a bug flying around from my plant. So in here, so on my desk. So anyway, moving on, you also want to look at things like strength of argument, rhetorical techniques and strategies, all of those good things that you really want to look at in terms of identifying how everything works together, how to keep it moving, how to kind of identify, are the ideas working, are they not, are they actually saying what the author's trying to say, or what I think the author's trying to say, are they not, why not, how can we make it better, ultimately. So that kind of leads us into our editing type skills, where we also have punctuation, kind of fixing those kinds of errors that you see, and helping with flow. Again, I apologize, my cat is just continuing to cry. Redundancy, So that is more dealing with identifying when you're unnecessarily repeating yourself, or you're providing information that you've already provided. Okay. Repetition is very similar to that. It's unnecessary for you to be providing, to be repeating, unless you're deliberately doing repetition for like a given purpose. And authors always do repetition deliberately. You never want to do it unintentionally. Okay. And you want to use it sparingly. So if you see a piece in this exam that is full of repetition, chances are it's not supposed to be that way. And they're trying to make sure that you know that. Okay, rather than an author deliberately using repetition, which only the best authors kind of do. So data interpretation and analysis are other type questions. Again, we kind of talked about that when we were going through the reading from the reading test. But those are the kinds of questions that you have to analyze and synthesize and assess. Okay. Grammar type questions, we're kind of dealing with understanding diction, homophones, you have related words, concision of language, precision of language, idiomatic expressions, conventional expressions, verb tense, subject verb agreement, and you have all of these wonderful things about clauses, about comma usage, punctuation usage, dealing with different kind of phrases, and run-on sentences and fragments, dealing with possession, dealing with modifiers or misplaced modifiers, all of these good, fun grammar things that most students don't like. So what we're going to do now is really switch gears. I mean, these are all there are these additional grammar resources for everyone. I do highly encourage you to explore them because they are going to be helpful for you overall. They're going to give you kind of different breakdowns of grammar terms, and they are just educational resources that I think are very beneficial for students. They're user friendly, and identifying key errors in writing, and they can help you improve your own writing. So even if you're not using them so much for SAT prep, you can always use them for school. So they're from reputable sites, and kind of just great resources in general. And I think that everyone should kind of take a look at them. So what I want to take a quick look at, take a quick look at our grammar concepts. And actually, before we do that, maybe at 10 o'clock, we'll take a break. So, all right, here we are. So again, this is kind of the same thing that we just kind of went through, all of these different kinds of good resources, all that kind of good information about the main grammar concepts that you typically see on the test. That isn't to say that they might throw a grammar concept that's not covered on here. It's a possibility, but it's a slim possibility because they typically stick to things that are that they've used before, that that are common errors, easily confused concepts, or just kind of different ideas that you need to, like, that students often get wrong, that you need to be able to know and identify to express your command, to demonstrate your command of language, and your ability to be a communicator and communicate your ideas effectively through writing, through your knowledge of the writing process and the editing process, in order to be published, to be able to be a professional writer in whatever field you go into, okay, ultimately in college. So it kind of identifies what common errors people see or get confused about, or that are really kind of covered on the exam. And yeah, so, okay. So what I want us to do now is that we're going to be looking at, I'm going to stop sharing, and then I am going to pull up our grammar resource. Chloe's just joining us for our class, so I apologize again. You may hear her throughout the rest of the class. She's just being very, very vocal for today. Okay. All right. So last week, everyone should now be able to see on their screen. We looked at a few different concepts. I kind of want to go to so again, this is from the SAT and ACT Grammar Mastery book that is by Christian Heath. So I do not own this material. I highly recommend and encourage everyone to kind of examine it and any other grammar resource to kind of get you up to speed about any particular questions you might have related to writing or grammar. But in the meantime, we are going to actually go to, so like last time, I know we kind of started going over, we reviewed the parts of speech. Okay, so everyone at this point should really have, those notes were shared in previous classes, but everyone should have at least a very basic, a solid basic understanding of what the 8 parts of speech are. You should have had that kind of coming into this class, but if you didn't, you have those resources available and my notes about those categories in grammar. And then we can like discuss our discussion before last week, and I think the week before, about what sentences are, why we need subjects and predicates in order to have a sentence. And again, a sentence is just a complete thought or idea. So anytime you have an incomplete sentence, it means it's an incomplete thought or idea. So it means that it's generally missing either the subject, which is who or what the sentence is about, and or it is missing the predicate, which is basically the verb. In essence, it's the verb, but it includes other parts of the sentence too, like that are contributing to providing information about what's going on in the sentence, what's the action, what's the what is the subject doing. So what is the noun or pronoun that's the subject of the sentence doing or having done to it. So that's kind of that breakdown there. All right, so we did kind of go into, I mean, we did talk about rearranging word order that last week, in that we were dealing with a subject verb object word order for English in most cases, although we have a lot of flexibility in terms of how we can structure sentences, how we can organize and rearrange them. I also kind of want to go through, we started going through subject verb agreement, which is again kind of where we started. We looked at what subject verb agreement is, and that you need a subject and a main verb. So a verb that is the essentially the predicate, the main part of the predicate. Okay, so the main action in the sentence ultimately. And we also kind of discussed how you can have a singular or plural subject, and you can have a singular and plural verb. Also, your verb form will change depending on your point of view. So if you are dealing with, if you're writing something from the first person point of view, you will be using a different form than if you were writing in the third person point of view. Okay, so your perspective of who is speaking is also coming into play. So you need to be thinking about that. Does anyone have any questions about subject verb agreement before we kind of move on? I know we needed to do some additional examples from last week. We only got through like a few. Okay, so if you have, I'm going to give you a minute to kind of look at that. Okay, so no one has any questions. Okay, so if you don't have any questions on subject verb agreement in terms of understanding that you need singular or plural, that's great. I'm very happy about that. But remember, we also last week kind of looked at understanding tricky words that are tricky nouns that can sound to us like they should have a plural verb, but they actually are single. There's singular forms of a noun, so they need a singular verb form to match that. Okay, so some kind of tricky words that may sound plural but are actually singular are things like everyone, team, country, the whole business, the group, the team, pack, like a pack of dogs or a pack of cards, school of fish, like a school of fish, or school, like your school, right? So I mean, school is dealing with a collective whole, right? So that's kind of what we're dealing with here, is in terms of these tricky verbs, or these tricky nouns here, and where we're dealing with things that are dealing with a collective group. Okay, so that means that, but it's one group, even if it has many different parts. Like a school of fish has many different fish in it, but it's still just one school of fish. Okay, the same thing with a team. A team has many members on it, in it, like at least 2 members, right? And it would be, I mean, so there's still more than one person on a team, but the noun that you're dealing with is actually a singular noun because you're talking about one group, right? So everyone is kind of a collective noun that is really looking at like everyone, right? I mean, like that's what it is. So it's looking at all in a group. So it's an all kind of inclusive word, or type of group. So we have different kind of classifications of groups. In most cases for nouns in English, it's easier to tell whether or not, I mean, we typically just add a plural s, or maybe we might add an es, or it might have we might have an odd, like the word children, instead of the plural form of child is children. So we have a lot of irregular endings that came through the language over time, that are kind of retained in these older, more irregular forms of the language of the words. So we want to kind of keep that in mind as well, that you need to be able to be familiar with those types of irregularities for nouns, as well as to understand that there are cases where you have a noun that you're thinking of, it is dealing with a group. Okay, and that you're actually dealing with or that the noun itself is referring to a group of people or that type of thing. Okay, so you're looking at differences between singular forms and plural forms, and you always want to make sure, is this actually a singular form? I mean, or is it actually a plural form? Are we talking about it, or is this a collective noun? Okay, so that's kind of what we're dealing with here. Okay. And then we also looked at compound plural subjects. So that is using like things like conjunctions to help, like and, to help us combine subjects. So have more than one subject or more than one verb. So having compound predicates, that type of thing. Okay. So catching compound plural subjects. So that one, you also kind of want to be cautious when you have a sentence that's kind of interrupted by additional information because of how we've organized it. So the actual sentence, the dog jumps in the water, that's a complete idea, along with his many canine friends in this identifying trick compound section. Maybe I can, for this, the actual sentence is the dog jumps in the water. We can rearrange it so it says the dog jumps in the water along with his many canine friends. And that would make sense. So this information is actually from the predicate. So it's actually supposed to be part of that predicate. And it's just being rearranged. We can even rearrange it further and say, along with his many canine friends, the dog jumps in the water. So using a comma. So that's different ways to organize a sentence in terms of sentence structure. So we have different kinds of ways. You always want to make sure that you're actually dealing with a compound plural subject. But in this case, you're not. You're dealing with just a singular subject. Okay. Even though it seems like canine friends, like the friends should be included, it's not actually, because remember last week we were also talking about prepositional phrases where we have with being a preposition. So friends is actually the object of that preposition. So it's not the subject. So therefore our sentence is singular because dog is singular. And so our verb form needs to be singular too. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, I'm gonna have everyone take a very quick break for 5 minutes. So we're gonna come back at 10:10. We're gonna continue this little bit of grammar discussion, and then we will we'll start with math, like going through the practice tests for different things and looking at math. Okay, so everyone should be back here in about 5 minutes, so 10:10, and then we'll kind of continue. Thank you. Okay, so everyone has about a minute left. So actually, everyone should be coming back now. Sorry if you couldn't hear me. Everyone should be coming back now. So we said 10:10. So hopefully you had a good snack and everything. And we are going to continue with kind of our grammar discussion. Okay, so subject verb agreement, just kind of to recap where we were last week. So you want to think about identifying whether or not you have something that is just talking about one thing, or if you're dealing with more than one thing. Okay, so singular subjects go with singular verbs, plural subjects go with plural verbs. Okay, this is one of the most frequently used topics on the writing and language section. Okay, so you do want to make sure you understand this concept. which is also why I started with it after having a basic understanding of what nouns are, what all the different 8 parts of speech, the categories of grammar are. So do make sure that you understand that because this is going to be a key area. If not, please refer to the grammar resources that I've provided in the notes from our second session, my first session with you, but from the second week of class. Okay, so we do want to kind of also think about that you can use a test dealing with like you can say he says, she says, or he's like use he, she, it. So which are singular third person subjects, subjective pronouns, and then you have a plural form, which is third person plural is they. Okay, so he says, they say. Okay, so you can do that, or like he runs, they run, or she thinks, they think. So things like that you can use. There's a clear difference. So if there's an S on it, typically it is going to indicate that the verb is a singular form. Okay, whereas a plural form generally will have no S. Okay, so those are kind of testing ways you can test a verb and trust your ear to determine if a verb is singular or plural. Okay, but even if you have a subject like Michael and I, where you clearly have 2 subjects, okay, so we could actually replace Michael and I with they. And we would need to make sure that in both cases, whether you use Michael and I, or you like Michael and I will go to the store, or they will go to the store. So you want to make sure that you are using the appropriate form. You can substitute names or list for item like multiple nouns, but if you have like nouns in a series, you want to make sure that you can identify, you can replace it easily with they to refer to that group, and then use the singular form and figure out if you need the verb, so you can focus more on the verb once you change using subjunctive pronouns, so that you can figure out whether it is actually singular or plural that you need, and make sure then that the noun and noun or pronoun form and the verb form match. Okay, so that they are both singular or both plural. Okay. Another thing that you can do dealing with subject verb agreement is eliminating details and using logic to kind of help you figure out if the subject is singular or plural. And some words might sound plural, but are actually singular collective groups. Okay, so like the entire company or the whole country or the team, right? So something like that. You want to make sure, or everyone, those are technically grammatically singular collective groups, noun groups, basically. So that's one thing you want to remember. You also want to remember about compound plural subjects. Anytime you have a compound plural subject, you have more than one item in your subject, or more than one noun in your subject, you want to make sure that they are plural, okay? Because sometimes you will have like you might have several different names in a row, like in a series. So like 3 different names in a row separated by commas, and then the last one separated by a comma, like so Michael, comma, and comma Peter and Peter comma. So there, I mean, you wouldn't actually have the last comma. So it would be Michael, comma, Anne, comma, and Peter went to the game. So just as an example. So you could have three different nouns, three different proper nouns actually in a as the subject. So that could, those three names, the whole like Michael, Anne, and Peter can be replaced by they. Okay. So you can say they went to the game. In which case they is a pronoun that is being used to a subject pronoun that's being used to take the place of the nouns acting as a subject. So in this case, it's a plural subject. It's a third person plural form. So it's going to match an appropriate verb form that is also plural. Does that make sense? Anyone have questions on that? And then also just one last thing, again, dealing with a non-essential type of descriptive clause can sometimes, so like that example sentence that we were dealing with, where was it? I feel like it was here. No, it was dealing with the dog. So the dog, along with his many canine friends, jumps in the water. So this is an example of, you can actually identify here that this information in the center is actually unessential. So it's not necessary. What that really means is that the information is not necessary for us to understand the meaning of the sentence. We can understand the dog jumps in the water without, along with as many canine friends. That's just additional information that's being given. So it's a non-essential modifying phrase. We might call this a parenthetical clause. Okay. It's attached to the dog, but it's not essential information that's necessary for us to understand the structure and meaning of the sentence. Okay, so it doesn't affect our understanding of what the sentence is talking about. It just provides additional information that we can actually remove, and it still doesn't really alter our understanding of the core content of the sentence. So that's what we're kind of talking about here in this example. So sometimes you have what's called a non-essential descriptive clause that can seem like it's part of a compound plural subject. Like in that example, you might have thought that dog, his canine friends, so that we were dealing with the dog and the canine friends as the subject, which is not the case in that particular sentence. Only the word dog, is the noun dog, is the subject of the sentence. So non-essential clauses will never really count towards the main subject. So you can actually, we identified that there's actually a prepositional phrase in that sentence, and that you have that friends was actually the object, the canine friends were actually the object of that preposition. So they could not be, therefore, the subject of the sentence. So that was additional information, providing a little bit more clarification about the dog in question that we were dealing with, about what's going on in the sentence. Okay. All right, moving on. So I did want to look at one more example, because we didn't really get to, we did do a little bit last week, but I want us to move on to other grammar concepts. So I think we could look at, let's look at number 4. Okay. Arching their backs and hissing is a behavior common to many felines when they feel that their safety is threatened. So number 4, in case you can't really see it, I'll see if I zoom in, I'll have to zoom out. But arching their backs and hissing is a behavior common to many felines when they feel their safety is threatened. You could keep it as is. You could change it to arching their backs and hissing are a behavior common to many felines when they feel that their safety is threatened. You could change it again to arching their backs and hissing, behaviors common to many felines when they feel that their safety is threatened, or change it to arching their backs and hissing are behaviors common to many felines when they feel that their safety is threatened. Which answer choice here do you think makes the most sense? And please put it in the chat. Or you can put it in the Q&A if that works easier for you. But I'd like everyone to take a look at number 4 and try to see if you can figure out what would be the most appropriate here. Any thoughts? So, okay, so someone has an idea. So someone is saying A. So going with, and another person thought D. So what does the class think? Is it A or is it D? And why is it not B or C? What's happening in this sentence? Okay, so someone said that B and C read weird, which is an excellent observation. So if we kind of read through that, listen to me for, I'm going to read through B first, okay? And then we'll read through C, and then we'll talk about A and D, okay? So choice B is arching their backs and hissing are a behavior common to many felines when they feel that their safety is threatened. Listen to it one more time. Arching their backs and hissing are a behavior common to many felines when they feel that their safety is threatened. So does that sound right to anyone, or does it sound weird? I'm not saying it's right either way. So I'm not dismissing it as an answer choice. I wanted to know what you kind of think about. Any thoughts? So the student who did say that choice B just sounded weird was actually right. It is wrong. It's not an answer choice. And we're going to get into why, but I want to read through question C first. I mean, the answer choice C first, and see if you might, if how people feel about this one. Okay. So choice C, so we've already kind of eliminated B. We could use process of elimination to cross that off. Okay. Choice C would read as arching their backs and hissing behaviors common to many felines when they feel that their safety is threatened. So I'm just going to go and say here that that one, we're missing something. Okay, so I mean, you can actually even see it, that this choice is very different from everything else. So because we're missing another verb, okay? Everything else has another verb in it. Okay, so yeah, every answer choice involves the word hissing. So the verb, the ing form of the verb. So it's being kind of used as a noun. It's being used as a noun here. So arching their backs and hissing kind of as, I mean, those are actions that are being described. But they are not sufficient, like just without a verb, an extra verb, it just doesn't work. So we do need a verb form that is going to reflect that. So we just need to figure out, are we dealing with a singular or plural verb, right? Because otherwise the verb that we add is or are. So C doesn't make sense and B doesn't make sense either, just because they're not sounding right to us by our ear, because there's either something missing or there is information that's wrong in it, that it's an incorrect form that just isn't flowing right. Choice D, hissing are behaviors. So someone thought it is choice D and someone thought it was choice A. So if we look at choice A first, arching their backs and hissing is a behavior common to many felines when they feel that their safety is threatened. So what is our subject here? If we know that we've already kind of determined that there has to be a verb form that we're using, how many subjects do we have? Is this a singular subject that we're dealing with in this sentence, or do we have multiple subjects? So someone tell me in the chat, please. It's okay if you're not sure, because this one's actually kind of tricky. Okay, so someone answered that there are multiple subjects. Okay, so what are those subjects? What are the subjects that we're dealing with in this sentence? Felines, okay. So let's look at the sentence is about, like, the felines are the topic, are part of our topic, but I'm going to say that that's not actually what our, and my feline is making a lot of ruckus, so I apologize. But that's not actually the subject in this sentence. So what else could that be? And why would felines, can someone answer for me why felines would not work here as the subject? I mean, we have a bunch of things going on in the sentence. Okay, so if we kind of look at how this sentence works, let's kind of look at it in isolation. So let me switch to a whiteboard here. And then I will, all right, so we'll kind of go through this. So arching there. All right, so looking at this kind of expression here, can everyone see the whiteboard on their screen? Yeah, okay. So arching their backs and hissing is a behavior common to many felines. So if we kind of look at this sentence, we want to kind of identify what might be our what might our subject be? Okay, so if I actually kind of let's see what this actually lets me. I'm gonna not do it on this whiteboard. We're gonna do it on a different one. Just because I want to be able to use a highlighter better. All right, so looking at this sentence in isolation, I will share my screen in just a second for everyone so you can see this. All right, so if we look at this question, let me just put the question up again. So arching their backs and hissing is a behavior common to many felines when they feel threatened, that their safety is threatened. So if we kind of look at this, I'm going to make it bigger. Okay, so everyone should see this on their screen. If you do not, let me know. But if we kind of look here, I'm going to just choose a color. I'm going to underline just the section that needs to be that's part of the part that we're looking on at for the grammar in isolation. So if we're identifying that felines seems to be the subject, or you feel that it's the subject, we need to kind of look at what is happening in the sentence. Where are our actions? What are our verbs in this where are they? Can anyone identify the verbs in this sentence? Because that's our starting place to figuring out what our subject is. So please let me know in the chat where you think the verbs are or what they are. What are verbs? They're actions, right? Or they're expressing a state of being. What is our verb here? I mean, we have several. Let's see if we can maybe just highlight some of them. Okay, so there's a lot going on in here. I'm going to choose green, I guess, for our verbs, identifying words that are verbs in the sentence. Okay. I'm just identifying verb forms right now. Technically, these are also kind of verb forms that we're dealing with. So we have a lot of different verb forms here. Let's figure out where subjects are too. Okay, so subjects just are like where we have nouns. So nouns, this is a noun, right? Behavior is a noun. Sorry, I'm gonna make it the same color. Felines is a noun. We also have a pronoun. And I'm going to break that down. We have possessive pronouns or possessive adjectives. And then we have, so common is a descriptive word. So we have adjectives. Many is also an adjective. We have safety. So safety is also a noun, right? So looking at this, how do we figure out what our verb is? I mean, we have so many things going on in the sentence. How do we break it down? How do we identify what is the actual action in the sentence, the main verb and the main noun? One way that we can do that is identify prepositional phrases. Okay. That requires knowing what a preposition is and what it does and identifying what those many different words are. Okay. So if I go here, too many felines, too in this case is actually a prepositional phrase. Two felines. So felines is actually an object of that preposition too. So it is not the subject of our sentence. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. We're also going to identify a difference here with we have behavior. Behavior is actually acting as an object. A noun that is acting as an object. So that can't be our subject. So arching their backs and hissing blank is a so arching their backs and hissing, that's the part of the first part of our sentence. Okay. Behavior is an object. Even though we have when they feel, so they feel, that's actually, we have a pronoun that's acting as a subject, and we have a verb that matches it. And then we have, but it's part of this kind of relative clause here where we're dealing with when they feel that their safety is threatened. We have safety is threatened. So is threatened is a verb form. You have safety being the subject belonging to that verb, but it's not our main verb in this sentence. Okay, it's actually part of this kind of relative clause that we have here is going on. You also have arching their backs. So their backs, that's a noun, right? But we have to actually look at what these arching, what arching is here. So we have what's actually called, should be a deponent. A deponent verb. Okay, so that means it's essentially kind of like a verb form that is being turned kind of into a noun. Okay, so it has kind of like passive form, but it's active in meaning. Okay, so arching their backs and hissing, that's actually what we're talking about. We're talking about behaviors, more than one behavior here. Arching their backs is one behavior. Hissing is the other behavior. Okay, so even if we go back to looking at our example here, arching their backs and hissing is a behavior common to many felines when they feel that their safety is threatened. We noticed that B and C didn't work. C didn't work because there was no verb. So our main verb is actually this one, where we're dealing with that is, and we have to determine if it's an is or an are. Okay. And you can kind of tell that because the three of them have a verb form there. Only one of them didn't. And when we read through that one that didn't, it didn't sound right. Although it sounded a little bit like the word behaviors might make sense there. But it might make more sense to have D or A, right? Because they have that verb form. Okay. So looking here, we know that we have actually a plural subject. So, and our verb forms are acting like they're acting like a noun here, kind of acting as our subject of the sentence. They're telling us who or what the sentence is about or what we're dealing with. The subject here is a bit more complex because it's dealing with arching their backs. That's a behavior. So it involves a behavior, involves an action. Okay, in some way. So you have to think about what a behavior is. Okay, so it's not, we're naming the behavior, arching their backs and hissing. I feel like you could also add crying to that as a common behavior for cats, but arching their backs and hissing are two separate behaviors. Okay. And so what we're really looking at here is that we have a plural subject. So we need a plural verb form to match to it. And again, I apologize, my cat just keeps talking. So arching their backs and hissing are behaviors common to many felines when they feel that their safety is threatened. That is answer choice D. So answer choice D is actually the correct answer. Answer choice A is not, because we have a singular verb form is, which is incorrect. And then we also have a singular behavior when we're actually dealing with two different behaviors. Okay. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So this particular example was a tricky one to kind of break down because we were dealing with, again, kind of a collective, or we're dealing with a different kind of noun than you're used to seeing, because we're dealing with a behavior. So a behavior has to do with an action. So we were looking at an action. So it looked very deceivingly like a verb when it was actually being used as a noun. Okay, so that has to do with the verb forms being in their deponent form, okay, or being being used as a gerund, that are talking about, so as more of a noun form than what they are like we would normally see. Let's look at one other quick one, and then we're going to kind of continue with the grammar and move on to a different topic before switching to our practice test to kind of look at some actual examples here. So if we look at, what's a quick one maybe? Let's look at 6. Okay, so there is more than 2 decades left until the next major earthquake is expected to shake California. So we have A, which is keeping it as is. B, there have been more than 2 decades left until the next major earthquake is expected to shake California. C, there are more than 2 decades left until the next major earthquake is expected to shake California. And it has, for D, it has more than 2 decades. That automatically, I think, should send alarm bells going off in your mind and saying that no, it has does not make sense. It has more than 2 weeks. We don't know what we're talking about either. So it's very vague and would not likely be the best answer choice here. And it's also very different from everything else that we see. So do you think it's A, B, or C, since we've kind of eliminated D as a possibility for number 6? So someone said C. So C, there are. That is actually correct. There are more than 2 decades left until the next major earthquake is expected to shake California. Yeah, that makes sense because the sentence within the sentence, like the phrase within the sentence, the next major earthquake is expected would be the right verb form for earthquake, which is the subject there. But there are more than 2 decades left. So we're dealing with 2 decades. Okay, so 2 decades are left until the next major earthquake. So you're dealing with, it's a little bit tricky here because you have there as the acting as your subject, introducing your subject there, but you can figure out that it just makes more sense. It's the only one that really kind of sounds right. And the other ones are changing the verb form or changing the subject. And they just don't flow as well in this given context. They kind of lack sense in a way. So you can kind of pick that out. Okay, so does this make more sense to everyone a little bit? And we can kind of just confirm. So we looked at question 4 and question 6. So they do kind of are kind and give you the answers, which I think is why this text also is very good for students. So they said D, which is what we said for 4. And then for 6, we said C, or they said C, and we said C. There are, yeah. Okay. I want to look at one more quick grammar concept. So they have explanations too, which are really helpful for students, but we kind of just discussed it. So talking about verb tense and form. So this is related to subject verb agreement in a way because it relies on your understanding of what form of a verb is most appropriate. Not only is it just singular or plural, but it is dealing with present tense, past tense, or future tense. So this has to do with properties of verbs. Okay. So you're telling when the action of a sentence is happening, whether it's happening in the past, present, or future. Okay. So I think this concept tends to be pretty straightforward for most students, and that you understand the difference between past and present and future, or at least you should by now. But there are some of the easier ones to find that and explain to kind of look for illogical timelines or sequences. Okay. The verb form is similar to verb tense, but you're dealing with looking at kind of verb-based mistakes. So whether or not you're using like, please let me to go shopping, you're using the infinitive to go, which is the wrong form of the verb. So making the correct choice of a verb tense and form is often linked with parallelism, which we're going to get into in a future lesson here. Like, please let me go shopping. So make sure that everything is matching up properly. Okay. You also have pronoun antecedent agreement errors and things like that that can happen related to verbs. So basically, verb tense basically has to do with the order of events in a sentence or paragraph's timeline. So is it appropriate given the context? Determining the timeline, the context matters. So finding clues to the time periods and order of events within the sentence or paragraph. Also parallelism, so it has an influence on the correct choice for verb tense and form. So we're going to kind of start with that next time in our next lesson. To kind of look here at some examples, you have, while you were at the hotel eating lunch, I will be at the gym for my daily workout. What example do you think might work there? So in this choice, we have you are, or you were, you are, you were being, you have been. Those are all different verb forms. Are any of them, are they all the same tense? They're different forms, so that kind of clues you into that they're different tenses in most cases, or accomplishing different things. They might work within the same realm of tense in terms of like being a past tense form, but they might be in the expressing active voice or passive voice. So they might be an active verb form rather than a passive form. You have been is a passive form because you're dealing with a helping verb have. You have you were being, that's also more of a passive form, but you're also dealing, for both of these, you're dealing with past tense. You were is more of an active form, but it's also past tense. You are is not past tense, that's present tense. So we want to kind of look at the context, broader context of the sentence here. While you were at the hotel eating lunch, I will be at the gym for my daily workout. That's combining past tense with future tense. So we need to understand that we're talking about a situation where we need to figure out that I will be at the gym for my daily workout. That's something that hasn't happened yet. We're not going to be talking about the past and talking about something that hasn't happened yet in the same sentence. So you were doesn't fit here. The past tense forms don't fit here. You need to have you are, while you are at the hotel eating lunch. So while talking about the present tense, I will be at the gym. So it's dealing with something called like the subjunctive tense, where you're kind of, and also kind of conditional here. So you're kind of combining different verb forms based on kind of parameters of like, this is hypothetically, while you are at, this is what's going to happen now, and this is what's going to happen. It's a related event that you're connecting. And we're going to get into this more in depth next week. But does this kind of make sense? That I think you are makes more sense here. So one, the answer choice is B, which is you are. Okay. I do want to kind of switch gears to looking at our practice test, because I think this is going to help actually looking at our practice test answers from this past week. So everyone should have practice test 6 on their screen. We're going to spend a little bit of time looking at this, and we're going to talk about math. Okay, so did anyone have any questions on the reading test, or can we kind of focus more on the writing and language test for this week? You'll have my annotations, of course, as always. And you can kind of see my breakdown of each passage and my notes. I took a lot of notes as usual. So any questions on the coding? Any questions on any particular questions you wanted to look at specifically? No? Okay. I thought that this reading passage was relatively straightforward. So here you can kind of see notes that I'm making. Objectivity versus subjectivity. I'm making notes in the margins, identifying key information, even in the infographic. Control and variable, kind of looking at kind of breaking down what each section is really sort of talking about, or things that I found were key to take away so that I could find it later. Identifying a purpose question and realizing I should tackle that last because it's more of a big picture question, and then focusing on the more detail oriented questions first and building from there. Law and order versus mob law and chaos. I don't have any questions on this particular, like the particularly historical passage, because we had 1838, a work from Lincoln, and then we had our President Lincoln, and we had 1849 by Thoreau. So these were kind of dense works that you might have had questions on in terms of breaking them down. I mean, you may have had questions on the science passages too, but I think historical works tend to be less straightforward for most students. So no one had any questions from passage, from the paired passage for this week? Or it makes sense? Okay. So this one had a lot of text detail type questions, and inferencing type questions. There was even like a central concept thesis, kind of analogy type question, also with a purpose, all in one question. Text detail, analogy based, because you're dealing with kind of comparing Lincoln and Thoreau's different perspectives, all of that. Solar industry, kind of looking at my notes, kind of key ideas that I'm overarching concepts, identifying those types of things. Point of view, we don't see that very often. but there's a point of view question. Data response, of course. No questions on all those? Okay, then let's look at some of these writing and language questions. So this first passage that you had from homework this week, it kind of breaks down. So section 1, it's for the first sentence. So you want to actually read the full sentence, and it's a long sentence. It's in the winter of 1968, scientists David Schindler and Greg Brunskill poured nitrates and phosphates into Lake 227. This is one of 58 freshwater bodies that compose Canada's remotely located experimental lakes area. Okay, so that spans 1, 2, 3, 4, going on to a 5th line. So that's a pretty long sentence. What they're asking you, there are also like numbers that you need to know. So you should have been doing a lot of circling in here. There are a lot of pronouns. So there are, I mean, they're not pronouns, but proper nouns in here. So things like names, identifying kind of key ideas. So 58 freshwater bodies. So I was not only identifying the number, but I was identifying a number of what, so that I could easily reference it. And that type of thing. Okay, so here we have a few things going on. So in this example that we have 227, comma, this is 1. So this example, we have punctuation usage that we're kind of covering. So it's actually a you can kind of see in the answer choices that you change in answer choice B to a period and start and capitalize which is 1. So we kind of separate things. C, we also have a period and we start with the word 1 capitalized. And then D, we just use a comma and take out this is. We say 1 only. Okay. So here, 227. So the number is important. We need to know what we're dealing with. We have a lengthy first part of the sentence and a lengthy kind of second part of the sentence until area. So we need to identify what each question is, or each part of this question is looking at. So this first example is actually a comma splice. Okay, so what that means is that it's an unnecessary comma here. We're actually, what this question is supposed to be looking at is comma usage dealing with separating independent clauses. So we need to kind of look at how to break this down appropriately. So scientists David Schindler and Greg Brunskill poured nitrates and phosphates into Lake 227, comma, this is one of the 58 freshwater bodies that compose Canada's remotely experimental lakes area. So we actually have 2 complete sentences here. So 2 independent clauses. So that is also kind of hinted here by the fact that you have 2 periods in here as 2 potential answer choices, and then 2 other examples of a comma. So here we ultimately, like, choice B and C end up being examples of fragments, because remember, a fragment is a sentence that's incomplete. It means that it either lacks a subject or it lacks a predicate. So if we read it as, in the winter of 1968, scientists David Schindler and Greg Brunskill poured nitrates and phosphates into Lake 227, which is one of the 58 freshwater bodies that compose Canada's remotely located experimental lakes area. That is not a complete sentence. It's a fragment. We don't know what we're talking about. We're missing a subject, really. This is part, like, we have kind of it's being, we're adding kind of we're making it dependent. We're making it a dependent clause as opposed to an independent clause because of, or like a subordinate type clause here when we're dealing with the word which, okay? Which is why you can see that there are several examples where they take one out, take that word out and focus on just one, all right? If we separate them completely, take out the this is, and just start with one, let's see what happens. In the winter of 1968, scientists David Schindler and Greg Brunskill poured nitrates and phosphates into Lake 227, one of the 58 freshwater bodies that compose Canada's remotely located experimental lakes area. We don't really have a verb there necessarily. It's not being clear. I mean, it just doesn't make sense because we're actually trying to connect these two different ideas because they're related. So we need to, it's creating a fragment here that just doesn't work in this context. So choice A, B, and C don't really work. So D is the only one that does. And that's because we're taking out the this and this is. So we're kind of making it a continuation of the sentence rather than two separate sentences. So in the winter of 1968, scientists David Schindler and Greg Brunskill poured nitrates and phosphates into Lake 227, one of the 58 freshwater bodies that compose Canada's remotely located experimental lakes area. So this phrase, from one until area, is describing what Lake 227 is. Okay, so it's providing additional information about Lake 227. It's clarifying what that means. So it is not, it's actually providing non-essential information here. So it's not necessary for us to necessarily fully understand what's happening and what's the main action, which is that David Schindler and Greg Brunskill poured nitrates and phosphates into the lake. That's the main action that's happening in this sentence. This additional portion is providing clarification about what Lake 227 is. Okay, so it's combining these ideas so that we can, and providing clarification so that we can kind of have it like smoothly flow and transition from one idea to the next. Does that make sense? Okay. Question 2, I'm not going to go through everything. I only want to go through a few more examples here, and we're going to look at math. But we have comma usage again, dealing with introductory and dependent clause. So you have 3 examples of a misplaced comma. So the comma is in the wrong position. Okay. So our example here is, while deliberately adding chemical compounds to a lake may seem destructive and irresponsible, this method of experimenting is sometimes the most effective way to influence policy and save the environment from even more damaging pollution. So looking at that flowed pretty well when we read through it. We have our main sentence being, this method of experimenting is, so this method is sometimes the most effective way to influence policy and save the environment from more damaging pollution. That's our main clause here. That is our main sentence, our sentence. So the additional information that's being provided is being added. So we have a dependent clause being added to introduce additional information, but it can't stand by itself. So it's not something that we would need to separate into 2 different sentences, because one is a dependent clause, the other is an independent clause. Okay, so dependent meaning it depends, it relies, it has to be attached to an independent clause in order for it to function. Okay, it can't stand by itself. And that would be from while until irresponsible. That's the dependent portion of this sentence. And the independent clause goes from this down to pollution. So the other answer choices add commas where they don't need to be. So you have choice D has the comma ending after this method, which means that of experimenting, it just doesn't sound right, because this method of experimenting is a subject. So of experimenting is a prepositional phrase, so it's not actually the subject. Method is the subject here. Okay, so therefore the comma that we need has to actually come before introducing the independent clause. Okay, and in this example for D, that means it's showing it coming after, which is incorrect. Choice C puts the comma after and, which doesn't make any sense in this context. So destructive and irresponsible, this method, it makes it choppy and it doesn't make it flow well. And it's just an incorrectly placed comma. Choice B, you have destructive followed by and irresponsible, this method. You need a pause between irresponsible and this method. So because irresponsible is marking the end of the dependent clause, this method is starting the independent clause that the dependent one is attached to. Does that make sense? Okay. Question 3 is a punctuation question. So you're dealing with concision as well as clarity in addition to the punctuation actual grammatical requirement. So it's asking you to really look at which choice effectively combines the underlined sentences. So you're not only having to look within the broader context of the paragraph, or as well as within this sentence here, you have to look for the most precise way of saying something and making it easy to understand and clear. So that's kind of what you're looking for, but it's also a question that focuses on changing some of the punctuation here. So where that is happening is the period is between the two different sentences. So you have two sentences listed here. You have, in addition to being unsightly and odorous, these algal blooms cause oxygen depletion. Oxygen depletion kills fish and other wildlife in the lakes. They're looking for an answer choice that will combine these two sentences because they're related. That's what they're trying to do. Choice A is an incorrect usage of a colon because you have two different, because of the way they kind of break it down is that they have, in addition to being unsightly and odorous, these algal blooms cause oxygen depletion, the result being that it kills fish and other wildlife in the lakes. That's actually incorrect. It might make you think it's correct, but you don't use a colon to set off a complete independent phrase. You would use it to add additional information, clarify, or that kind of thing, but it's not appropriate here. In the second one, they do use a semicolon. So, but in this case, you have to choose what actually makes the most sense in this context. So, in addition to being unsightly and odorous, these algal blooms cause oxygen depletion. The algal blooms cause oxygen depletion that kills fish and other wildlife in the lake. So it's being redundant in this case. Okay, it's not being precise. And here, the answer choice A was also still a bit wordy. So just like this one, it just is not working. Choice C, in addition to being unsightly and odorous, these algal blooms cause oxygen depletion, and oxygen depletion caused by the algal blooms, kills fish and other wildlife in the lakes. Again, that's they tried to combine the two different sentences, and it's just very, very wordy and hard to follow. So it doesn't make sense. It's not concise. It's not clear. And the punctuation isn't the most appropriate. Okay. Choice D ends up being the right one. In addition to being unsightly and odorous, these algal blooms cause oxygen depletion, which kills fish and other wildlife in the lakes. So this is providing additional information about why oxygen depletion is bad, and why these algal blooms are bad, in addition to them being unsightly and odorous. So D is the most appropriate answer choice. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? So here, last one, I think for today, and we'll kind of switch gears. So question 4, we have no change. So here we're again dealing with kind of combining sentences. So we have to kind of read both sentences and figure out if it makes sense. Okay. So that means we have to go to the beginning of this sentence, which is here. Just weeks after the scientists added to nitrates and phosphates, the water in Lake 227 turned bright green. It was thick with the same type of algal blooms that had plagued Lake Erie. So here, we're definitely dealing with a punctuation-based question, okay? But we're also dealing with an independent clause-based question, so combining sentences type questions. So we have to look not only at this punctuation, but this colon here as well. Okay, so we have to figure out what makes the most sense. So it relies on your knowledge of when it's appropriate to use a colon, and also to make sure that you understand that the first one, whether or not we have one sentence here or two, if each of these are complete thoughts or ideas, so it requires sentence level knowledge as well. So choice C just changes in that it replaces the colon at the end here with a horizontal bar. Or actually, in this case, it's an M dash here, but they have, it was thick with the M dash. So the M dash is the longer one. It's longer than a hyphen, and longer than an N dash, which is like 2 lengths of a hyphen. Okay, so the M dash is the longer one. They don't test you specifically on the type of dash you're using, unfortunately, but they good for you, but they do require you to know how to use that dashes, okay, appropriately. So it was thick with, and then using a dash doesn't make sense in this context, because you would rather say it was thick with the same type of algal blooms that had plagued Lake Erie. That flows better than having punctuation between with. Okay, where it would be something like, it was thick with the same type of algal bloom. So there's a pause there. So a dash can indicate a pause, like a comma can indicate a pause. A colon is a stronger pause. Is not as strong as a period, but it is, or as a semicolon, which is a semicolon ends up being used to separate two distinct ideas from one another, so two complete sentences, whereas a colon is used to kind of, in this case, like it's being used to introduce an independent clause. Okay, so you have an independent clause starting with the same type of algal blooms that had plagued Lake Erie. That's a complete sentence. Or even, it was thick with the same type of algal blooms. That part is complete. So you need to figure out that whether or not this first part is indeed a sentence, and it is not. It can't stand by itself, because you have just weeks after the scientists added the nitrates and phosphates, the water in Lake 227 turned bright green. That part, the water in Lake 227 turned bright green, that part is independent, but the first part is not. So we need to figure out why we can use a comma here. And that reason is because you're adding this information, combining it, creating a compound type sentence here. Does that make sense? So in this case, the most appropriate punctuation is that using a colon after green. The reason for that is because you already have an independent clause. And after an independent clause, you use a colon you can use it to introduce another kind of statement here, a complete thought. Okay. Use a colon to introduce an independent clause here. Does that make sense? All right. So we have transitions, singular past tense verb, agree, and number, singular subject, consistency of tense. So if we kind of look at this one, again, it's very similar to, so the experiment confirmed suspicions when half of the lake containing the phosphates was teeming with blue-green algae. You're dealing with a singular past tense verb, which agrees in number with the singular subject. So again, just kind of what we've been talking about. You need to be able to identify what the subject is. So in this case, making sure that you have a singular subject. So your singular subject is the experiment here, because it's not lake, because lake is part of the prepositional phrase of the lake. It's not actually, experiment has this verb confirmed as its that it matches to. Suspicions is an object of confirmed when the half of the lake containing the phosphates was teeming with blue-green algae. Okay, so here we're looking for, we're dealing with half of the lake, basically. So half is our subject, was teeming. So half was teeming, as opposed to half were teeming, half are teeming, half teams. So this particular verb is an antiquated verb. It's one that you might not hear very often, but it is still a valid verb, and you can see that you can still use it in the present and past tense and in more active forms. But we know that we were dealing with past tense, so the present tense wouldn't work. So teams and are teaming wouldn't work here, because they are present tense, whereas were teaming is past tense, but it's plural. So we're dealing with a plural verb, and we would need a plural subject, but our subject is only singular. So we need a corresponding singular verb form in order to, that's in the past tense, in order to conform to what this sentence needs. Does that make sense? Okay. There were a few other ones kind of in this grouping. We had some rhetorical strategies and techniques, counter argument, effective counter argument, things like that in here. Plural noun, singular possessive pronoun, adjective, adverb, transition, comma splices, possessive pronouns, semicolon usage, Main idea, verb usage, participle, lacks main verb, like all these different kinds of things. Trying to see if we had any other subject, verb, object. Here, this one also works. So 30, if you weren't sure, check out my notes on that to kind of give you a breakdown of that. These have more to do with ideas. Dependent clause, concision, clarity, logic, flow, prepositional phrase, consistency of accuracy, cohesion, non-essential clauses, M dashes is a good example there. Present perfect verb. So different verb tenses. Again, kind of what we were talking about today, possessive plural noun, adjective usage, singular pronoun agrees in number with singular antecedent. So again, you're dealing with a lot of like subject verb agreement and related concepts, like whether or not the pronoun is agreeing in number with its antecedent. Okay, so what it is describing, what the pronoun is replacing, that's been established already earlier on in the passage. Does that all make sense? I'm going to kind of assume so. And we're going to look at practice test 6. So we're skipping through reading and writing and language because we kind of just went through those and you had opportunities to ask questions. And I want to look at the kind of math concepts. But actually, before we do that, let's look at the reading quickly. So you had reading. If I switch my screen again. So if we going back up here to our readings. So this week you should have had 17 and 18. That should have been what was assigned. You should have already read about Heart of Algebra, which was the first math chapter. That was last week's reading. So 17 to 18. We did talk about Heart of Algebra a bit last week. Did anyone have any lingering questions about that chapter from that week, from the week prior, before we delve into problem solving and data analysis? Okay. Again. All right. So problem solving and data analysis. So here, this is available on the website for the College Board, math content alignment. So you have kind of problem solving and data analysis. So they're reflecting research kind of that is essential for college readiness and success. So that's kind of key information here. What we kind of want to take away from this is that you will have questions that will really focus on how to problem solve and how to interpret data and analyze it and apply it and be able to understand it. So problems in this kind of category are going to be really dealing with your quantitative reasoning skills. So being able to understand things about ratios, rates, proportional relationships, and kind of understanding units and kind of breaking them down as well. So you want to know kind of being able to understand how to create representation of a problem and considering the units that are involved and paying attention to the meaning of different quantities, knowing what they mean and how to use different properties of operations and objects. That's really what this section really focuses on in terms of categorization of math problems. I do encourage everyone to, again, to kind of continue looking through the video that is provided about the math section, because they're going to help you really break down how to approach each individual question. This is really kind of looking at the overarching concepts that are going to be covered in the math section, in addition to the algebraic expressions and equation types questions that you're going to see in as well in the two math sections. So you're dealing with learning how to identify quantitative measures, and covering things like figuring out overall patterns that you see or determining like striking deviations from overall patterns, and being able to understand and interpret and compare two different data sets or more than one data set. So this kind of helps you identify things like outliers on the measures of center of a data set. So just to kind of figure out things about related to data, interpreting not only what the information is in a problem, but also kind of helping you figure out how to solve them and how to correct errors when you identify them, when you see them. And these are really kind of focused on real world type of questions, real world type of problems that you have to deal with and apply math in most frequently in common situations. So some of these questions that are in the math section are going to be kind of academic or career context focused, in terms of like you're working in the sciences or you're working in doing like waitressing, or you are trying to sell something. So like dealing with marketing and sales and things like that, that you're going to be dealing with many areas from like science and social science, in addition to just kind of straightforward math. But they're really focused on giving you kind of core elements of core types of problems that you need to solve real life problems. So you have all the skills you need to succeed. So problem solving and data analysis is really one of the SAT Suite math subscores, which is reported on a scale of 1 to 15. This kind of domain feature really looks at multiple choice and student produced response type questions. Calculator use is typically is permitted on these questions, but is not always needed or recommended. So you are typically going to see a lot of these on more of like the calculator based section, because those are ones that you're allowed to use a calculator on, whereas the section 3 of the test, which is the non-calculator portion, really focuses more on mental math type skills, things that you don't need a calculator for. So data kind of questions deal with things like ratios, rates, proportional relationships, scale drawings, and solving single and multi-step problems. So this is kind of basic things that you should know how to kind of tackle. So it's not anything like dealing with pre-calculus or anything like that that's more complicated math, but it does require you understanding what ratios are, what rates are, how to create proportional relationships, how to deal with scale drawings, and interpret infographics and other kind of visual aids that are used in helping you solve a problem. It's going to be kind of looking at using proportional relationships between two variables to help you solve multi-step problems to determine a ratio or rate. You're also going to be asked to calculate a ratio and rate and then solve a multi-step problem. So one that is going to require more than one step. So you want to be able to identify is if your problem that you're looking at when you approach the test is a single step problem that you can probably do relatively quickly, or is it going to be a multi-step one that's going to take you more time? And if it is a multi-step problem, you need to be able to determine if there's a simpler way to solve it, so that you can move on and continue answering the questions. You also have kind of taking a given ratio or rate and solving a multi-step problem. So they're kind of, it might ask you to calculate and then solve the multi-step problem, or it might ask you to take a given ratio that they provide for you or rate and ask you to solve a multi-step problem. Generally, I think that the latter step where it's asking you to take a given ratio and rate and figure out how to solve it, I think that's easier for most students, but it might not be this case for you. I think it's a little bit easier for students to do that because it's going to let them or let you really have the material in the ratio that you need to solve it. And then you just have to be able to then take that information from whatever rate or ratio that they give you and extract the information you need to then solve and determine to solve the rest of the problem. So if they give you some information, then that's usually a helpful thing, but they also might use it to try to trick you in some cases too. So you just have to be cautious and careful and mindful of your time when you're completing the math section. And remember, you're always trying to get to the next question so you can finish the test. It might also ask you to solve single and multi-step problems involving percentages, where you're going to be looking at solving multi-step problems to determine percentage, calculate a percentage, and then solve a multi-step problem. Or it could give you a percentage, and then you are asked to solve a multi-step problem. So those are the kinds of problems that you'll really see that are dealing with percentages. So they could be a single or multi-step problem. So you want to make sure that you're familiar with percentages and how to manipulate them, how to determine them, how to create them, all of that. You also kind of want to brush up on your knowledge of measurement, quantities, units, and unit conversion. So they're only really going to ask you for common conversions. So things like possibly from inches to like dealing with two different, like the metric system versus the imperial system, or they might ask you to convert centimeters to meters or vice versa or something like that. So you might be working within a particular measurement system, or you might be working between two different systems, depending on what you need. And that could also apply to things like temperature conversion or other kind of key concepts, especially if you get like a physics oriented question or other kind of math, like maybe a chemistry oriented question where you need to figure out like boiling point or different things like that, and converting units or converting temperature. Like with astronomy, you could be dealing with different levels of temperature for stars, and dealing with particular types of so science, there are going to be some science crossover with math terms too. So you want to kind of be brushing up on all of those two things too. But also looking at things like dealing with determining a unit rate, using a multi-step problem to help you solve to determine for a unit rate, or calculating a unit rate and then solving a multi-step problem. It might give you it in reverse. So you might start with the unit rate that they give you and then have to solve a multi-step problem, or you might be solving a multi-step problem to determine the unit rate. You could also be solving a multi-step problem to complete a unit conversion, or to be able to calculate density or determine use the concept of density to help you solve a multi-step problem. So there's going to be combinations of science skills and math skills in here, as well as some social studies, I think. But generally speaking, it's mostly science and math. So that's one thing. If you're not really sure about those concepts, you do want to brush up on those in particular. You want to be looking at scatter plots, using linear, quadratic, or exponential models to describe how variables are related. So if you're given a scatter plot, you need to figure out you might have to figure out the equation of a line or a curve of best fit, given the data that you have. And what you're trying to accomplish. They might be asking you to interpret a line in the context of a situation, or they might be asking you to use a line or curve of best fit to make a prediction regarding similar information related to the question. You could be looking at things like using relationships between two variables to investigate key features of a graph. You might be making connections between graphical representation of a relationship and properties of a graph by selecting the graph that represents the properties described. Or you could be using a graph to identify a value or set of values. Okay, so you can see either of those on the exam. And these, again, are all skills that you should have started learning in at the earliest, or I guess the latest, roughly, in middle school. You might have started kind of covering some of these. So you want to brush up on these basic kind of mathematical skills in terms of dealing with linear relationships or dealing with linear growth and exponential growth, as well as identifying kind of information from graphs and being very familiar and comfortable with coordinate planes. And understanding like the different quadrants that you have and what they represent, especially when you're dealing with things like parabolas and or lines that have what the slope of a line is, like y equals mx plus b. That's the equation for a line, a straight line. So dealing with variables in a given context to order and determine kind of what the model best fits. So they're kind of a lot of different categories here. You're going to be looking at like two-way tables to summarize categorical data and relative frequencies and calculate conditional probability. So you're going to be dealing with categorical data and using categorical data to calculate conditional frequencies. So how often something might happen or would be likely to happen. So things like conditional probabilities, dealing with the chances of something happening given certain circumstances, dealing with association of variables or independence of events. So those are kind of key things too. Making inferences about population parameters based on sample data. So you are basically going to be given population data to help you figure out how to, like when you're dealing with the random sample of a population. So you're trying to create like you would if you were dealing with a science concept or maybe a social studies one, where you're trying to get an idea of historical data or scientific data and how to make it fair in dealing with randomization and things like that. So dealing with statistics, sample statistics, to help you kind of determine confidence intervals and measurement errors that you need to know about kind of when dealing with data. and when you're dealing and you're making use of data, but you might not need to calculate it. You might just need to be able to understand and be aware of it. So they're not going to actually test you on, like you're not doing a formal statistics course here. You're doing more of being aware of what statistics are and how to use them, how they can be applied in a science context, in a real world conditions, in humanities-based courses and things like that, or social sciences, for collecting data and information and interpreting it. So you're looking more at the idea level rather than at a technical computational level when you're dealing with things like populations and random samples. So you're also going to be using statistics to kind of investigate measures of centered data, and analyzing shape, center, and spread. So you're looking at data and you're basically looking at how to interpret and analyze it and assess it. So you're kind of looking at how can we characterize this data? How do we break it down? How do we identify key information about it that will be meaningful to achieve the outcomes that you're trying to achieve in solving a problem? So the measures of center that may be calculated can include mean. You can also include median and mode, and the measures of spread that may be calculated include range. So range, mean, median, mode, all of those terms are important for you to know, and you should know how to calculate them, and how to determine them from the data that you have available. If you're not sure how to do this, and you would like me to go through it with you, we can. Just let me know. You need to send me an email, and make a request. And if there's enough students, we can definitely schedule time to go through that. But I think the math videos also kind of break down those key concepts, because those are commonly tested ideas, that you see on the math sections. Evaluating reports to make inferences, justifying conclusions, determining appropriateness of data collection methods. So you're kind of assessing whether or not the method of collection of information is valid, and if in terms of, like, if you're working in a science field, is this actually like following the scientific method? Is it dealing with, like, is it biased? Is it not? Looking at, are we making objective decisions rather than subjective decisions regarding data? And kind of looking at consisting, like, the reports that you might be looking at would be things like tables, graphs, text summaries, things related to data, and dealing with whether or not they're appropriate data collection methods that are being used, and making inferences from that data, that are on the tables, the graphs, etc., and using that to help you justify a particular conclusion. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. I do kind of want to take a quick look at the other math section if we have time. We have a little bit of time left. So that was really kind of the problem solving and data analysis type questions. And now we have, for passport to math, we have additional information. So passport to advanced math. This section is really important for you to master before you end up studying even more advanced math concepts. So this is to help segue and introduce you and set you up for success in a higher level math class. So college level math in particular. It's also to help you if you're going to, like, move into a more, like, you're going to be taking calculus for the first time, or you are in high school, or you're moving on to an AP curriculum, or you need to be in a higher level math class. You're trying to do like a statistics class or something like that, or more mathematical theory and that type of thing. So you need to be able to master these skills to help you before you try to tackle more complex math. So these are things that you need to be very familiar with, very comfortable with before you even try college level math or things like that. Okay. So this again, kind of the the substance here that was the word I was trying to go for. Substance really of this section is dealing with topics that have to do with understanding structure of expressions and the ability to kind of analyze, manipulate, or rewrite these expressions. This domain also kind of looks at, so this is another domain score. It's one of the 3 SAT Suite assessment math subscores, just like the Heart of Algebra subscore and the data one that we just went over, again being reported on a scale of 1 to 15. So it's very important for you to kind of be familiar with this category of kind of math questions, and you kind of want to know how to manipulate, rewrite the expressions, and to be able to analyze the structure of expressions, and understand what it is that they're telling you, the information that they're providing for you. So it includes reasoning skills with more complex equations and interpreting and building functions. So this one, you sometimes use a calculator, but it's not always needed or recommended. So you might see some of these on the non-calculator portion of the math test. You might see some on the calculator portion. If it is on the calculator portion, chances are you probably do need a calculator. But you might be able to solve it without one. You can try. So it's not always, it's not like the data response where you do typically, like you're typically allowed to use a calculator to help you solve things for, but this is going to be questions that are focused more on like creating a quadratic or exponential function, or equation that models a given context. So your equation in that case is going to have rational coefficients and may require multiple steps to simplify or solve the equation. So you'll see probably a lot of those in there. You're going to see determining like the most suitable form of an expression or equation to reveal a particular trait given in a given context. So you might have to even change forms of an equation or expression in order to achieve certain outcomes, and understanding what equivalent forms are. Okay, and also like creating equivalent expressions involving rational exponents and radicals, including simplifying and rewriting other forms, as well as creating equivalent forms of the algebraic expressions using structure and fluency with different operations. Okay, you want to also be kind of, these questions really focus on solving quadratic equations too, dealing with rational coefficients in particular, and it can kind of be represented by like many different forms. You have a range of forms that can kind of end up dealing with for like the algebraic structure, and kind of it may also, those types of questions may require you to manipulate an equation to help you solve it. You might also be asked to do things like adding, subtracting, and multiplying polynomial expressions and simplifying the rest. The expressions are going to have have rational coefficients, so you're going to need to know how to deal with polynomials, what they are, how to manipulate them and simplify questions. figuring out how to solve an equation if one variable that contains radicals or contains the variable in the denominator of a fraction. So again, there are going to be things like rational coefficients, and you may need to identify a resulting solution when a resulting solution doesn't work, or it's just extra, like it's extraneous. It doesn't really fit into what you need to get done. It might be like superfluous in a way. So it's also things like solving a system of one linear equation and one quadratic equation. So you might be given something that has rational coefficients again, but you might be solving for a system of a linear equation and quadratic equation and figuring out how to connect them as well. Rewriting simple rational expressions. So adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing two rational expressions, or dividing two polynomial expressions and simplifying the result. And all expressions in that case will have rational coefficients. So if you don't know what a rational coefficient is, please check. I'm pretty sure that the videos actually do go through step by step what these kind of terms are. But if you're not sure or can't find it anywhere, please let me know and I'll go into it. But for the sake of time today, I'm not going to. Also doing things like interpreting parts of nonlinear expressions in other terms, their context, relationship between zeros and factors of polynomials, nonlinear relationships between two variables, function notation, interpreting statements using function notation and structure to isolate or identify a quantity of interest. So there are lots of kind of key concepts that we're going to continue talking about next time related to these math tests. So what everyone needs to be doing then for homework, you'll receive your homework email as usual. But I want to kind of just point out to you now what that is. So this week you did practice test 6. So for homework, what you're going to be doing are this week you did practice test 6 for homework, or we have practice test 6. My apologies if I confused you. So last week you did practice test. Last week we reviewed practice test 9 or practice test 10. And then this week you did practice test 6, where you read chapter 8, 13, and 17 to 18. This coming week, you should be doing practice test 3. Practice test 3 is your homework, okay? Last week was week 5. So this is week 6. You're doing practice test 3 for homework and self-scoring it. And then you're doing some reading. So you have chapter 9, 14, and 19 for reading for this week. And that, again, will be shared with everyone through email. If you have any questions, please let me know. Send me an email if I didn't get to cover any question that you had. But good work, especially going through kind of some more grammar. We'll do more of that next week, as well as more math. We're going to kind of move away from the reading for the moment, although we'll do a little bit with it. And just kind of go from there and working through different sections, especially practice problems. Okay. So fantastic work, everyone. I will see you all next week. And you'll be receiving the homework email as soon as possible. Okay. So great job, everyone. See you later. Take care.
Okay, so thanks for watching, and please remember to contact us at info@embracetutoring.com to set up any personalized private tutoring sessions you would like. Stay tuned for future videos, and best of luck with your studies. We definitely encourage you to visit our Instagram as well as TikTok pages if you have any questions along the way. Take care, guys. Best of luck with your studies.